we've got a problem with war, including, within the folks that claim to be national security experts in this room, around D.C., throughout the country. And that problem is, an understanding, or maybe a misunderstanding. So about 200 years ago, a gentleman named Clausewitz wrote something called Vom Kriege, or On War. And in it he said, war is politics by other means. What does that mean? When I was flying B-2s in Missouri during the Kosovo War, we used 2,000-pound GPS-guided munitions, the only ones, by the way, all of the ones in inventory. It was the first debut of the JDAM, which is used all over the world now, to basically take away the assets of the elites in Serbia to get them to hand over Milosevic so that he could face war crimes trials in The Hague. And that was successful. But it was only successful when we started targeting the elites' assets. So what was Clausewitz trying to say in saying war is a continuation of politics by other means? What he was saying is that we use military force when all other things have failed to achieve a political outcome, right? The Kosovo War was trying to get to a political outcome, was essentially to stop the genocide of the Kosovars. In the 5th century BC, Sun Tzu came out. What's that? The Art of War. Now, the historians debate whether it was actually a person or a group of people that wrote the document, but ultimately, there's a lot of famous quotes that people use out of that book. One, it goes, the supreme art of war is to subdue your enemy without fighting, right? So more of continuation of this politics idea. That's all the way back in the 5th century. Then 500 years ago, Machiavelli wrote The Prince. And in The Prince he wrote, never attempt to win by force what can be won by deception. Right? What do you know of war? When you think of war, when you think of national security, are you thinking of politics? In 1970, Edwin Starr sang, war. Huh. What is it good for? Well, what is it good for? In my career, in my 30-year-long career, I went to untold numbers of professional military education schools. I studied. I thought. And, when I sum all of that up, I would say that I probably had about 10% of the education of a typical People's Liberation Army officer, just in terms of what is war. 10%. And I would define that 10% as being in the camp of Jomini. Jomini, a Swiss officer, said, the first care of a commander, he's talking about a military commander, should be to agree with the head of state upon the character of the war. Now, when you think of Western warfare, when you think of our concepts of warfare, when you think of doctrine, current doctrine, joint doctrine in the U.S. military forces, think of Jomini. What was Jomini trying to say? Let's take politics out of it, right? I want to talk about the science of how you place your formations, right? What are the rules, right? Almost like Newton, the laws of gravity. Something falls at 32 feet per second squared. We know that. And so Jomini was trying to distill a set of laws that we could use. This is how we develop doctrine in the U.S. military today. It's how it's used. This is how we go to war. Now, before we go to war, we want to make sure, and when I say we, the general, the leader, in this case, a combatant commander, say in CENTCOM, the chairman of the joint services, the Secretary of Defense, what is the goal we're trying to achieve? What do we want out of this? Let us go do it, right? Just turn us loose. We don't want to be governed by politics. Okay, so something to think about. In the 5th century, Thucydides said, countries go to war for 3 reasons: fear, honor, and interest. Now, interest, I think we all know. There's a famous organization started by President Nixon, the national interest, right? So we understand the concept of national interest. What about fear and honor, right? Fear and honor. What's the science behind fear and honor? How do we calculate that? Right? So now we're starting to get this glimpse that maybe that Jomini's science of war is not sufficient in terms of the way we think about national security. Right? When you start to think about the theorists, the nuclear theorists of the first Cold War, what were they trying to achieve? They were trying to achieve fear. Right? Arms and Interest was the book. Fear is not measurable, right? But it's also a human emotion. So something very, very much more kind of social than, I would say, scientific. So more of an art. So or maybe art of war is correct. But is that the way that we think about war when we debate it, you know, in forums such as these? You know, I'm also a trained economist, and so there's a lot of similarities in neoclassical economics and other, let's say, other disciplines like, you know, say historical economics, behavioral economics. There's a whole host of them. But predominantly in the academia, neoclassical economics prevails, right? And what are they trying to do? They're trying to basically turn our economy into an equation that somebody can solve so that we can establish a policy that's science-based. But then we know that people have fear, and they act on that fear, right? So there's some interesting folks that have done interesting work in economics. Daniel Kahneman's one of them. Thinking Fast and Slow is his book. A reliable way to make people believe in falsehoods is frequent repetition, because familiarity is not easily distinguished from the truth. Authoritarian institutions and marketers have always known this fact. Unrestricted warfare, Chaoliang, General Chaoliang. By the way, the Chinese try to say he's not really significant in terms of thought leadership in China when it comes to national security, but they promoted him to general officer. So there's a little bit of a dichotomy there. If one party is at war with another and the other party does not realize it is at war, the party who knows it is at war almost always has the advantage and usually wins. Think about that. And then about 90 years ago, a gentleman named Mao Zedong says, it can therefore be said that politics is war without bloodshed, while war is politics with bloodshed. Right? So you know, when I talk to people about how we think about national security and how we think about the globe today and how we maintain or protect our interests, you know, political independence and sovereignty, the preservation of our republic, the Constitution that all military officers and public servants swear an oath to, right? How do we do that in a world that's been constructed today along the lines of what Kahneman said, of what Sun Tzu said, of what Mao Zedong said? How do we preserve our political independence and sovereignty in that environment? Here's something else to think about. You know, we like to point to World War II. That's a really good war. You know, we had complete and utter and total victory. We won. They lost. And that's the way war should be handled, right? That's the way we like to think of things. We're even talking about Russia and Ukraine and China today in the context of the Second World War, because by golly, that's when things were good. Well, let me just give this idea to you. August 6th and 9th, 1945. Hiroshima, 70,000 to 126,000 civilians killed, 7,000 to 20,000 soldiers, 12 Allied prisoners of war. Nagasaki, 60,000 to 80,000 killed within the first 4 months. 150 plus soldiers killed, 8 to 13 Allied prisoners of war killed, total killed 129,000 to 226,000. Right? How big was the weapon that was dropped on Hiroshima? Anybody know? 15 kilotons. We typically work on an order of magnitude 10 or 100 times that. Okay? Now, what was going on when that weapon was dropped? There was a 50,000 watt standard wave radio station on Saipan broadcasting a message stating that more Japanese cities would face a similar fate in the absence of immediate acceptance of the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. Okay. So now World War II's over. We're trying to make the world safe for democracy, and the Cold War begins. And in 1964, a one-star general in the Air Force named Glenn Kent is tasked with looking at what it would take, what it would feasibly take to protect the population from a nuclear strike. And so, and they tried to boil it down to science. The United States would strive to defend the worth in each of these circles. So they were talking about circles of value, you know, industrial areas of the country and population areas of the country. And the Soviets would attempt to destroy it. We assumed that the Soviets would attack where the worth destroyed per missile expended would be greatest, right? So they're trying to put this in a theoretical framework. And then they calculated to achieve 70% survival of the U.S. population against a stated Soviet deployment of ICBMs and SLBMs, which, by the way, still exist. Now they're augmented by the Chinese weapons. They didn't go anywhere. They're still there. The United States would have to spend, this is in 1964 dollars, $28 billion. But here's the problem. When you factor in the exchange rate between the ruble and the dollar, the Soviets are spending $1 for every 2 we're spending, protecting 70% of the population. And then if we want to protect 90% of the population, we're spending 6 while they're spending 1. Okay? So the Secretary of Defense observed that this was a race that we probably would not win and should avoid. So what did we do? Instead of seeking unilaterally to limit damage, we should undertake to negotiate a treaty with the Soviet Union to curtail the deployment of nationwide defenses. Do you remember that? This could set the stage for agreements to control the deployment of offensive forces, right? Okay, so this is using science. And what I tell you today, you know, after all the 30 years and 10 years being in the business environment, is that we're at war now. We're in the second Cold War, and I call it a digital Cold War. It's a Cold War where the weapons that just went into those theories still exist, and they still play a role. And so what do? We play on the outskirts of war. In the first Cold War, it was proxy war. Today, it's digital, right? 30% of young people get their news from TikTok. TikTok, controlled by the Chinese Communist Party through ByteDance, right? It's not about them stealing data. I wish to God I never want to hear somebody say TikTok's stealing data. It doesn't matter. What matters is the content they feed you on behalf of that data. What matters is the algorithms that are used to develop and curate that content to keep you hooked, and to then use that content to slowly change your perceptions, your behavior, right? It's not about you have some secret that the Chinese Communist Party wants. You have something more valuable. You have independence. And they want to convince you that it's better if you give that up. See, the Chinese Communist Party learned the lessons of the Soviet Union. Did we bomb the Soviets into submission? Was there total war victory in the Cold War. Absolutely not. They went bankrupt. They went bankrupt on the basis of ideology. They did so because we isolated them from the free world. So the same people that tell you that we need to spend trillions of dollars on F-35s and aircraft carriers to protect us are the same people that are giving the Chinese Communist Party the currency with which to wage the second digital Cold War. Not only that, all of our tech companies completely involved. I don't know, just the other day on LinkedIn, somebody calls in to get customer service from Microsoft. They're a company serving the defense industry. Guess who answers the phone? Lily from China. The world has changed. It's evolved. The concepts of war haven't. It's just our understanding of how those concepts are applied in a modern context, in the 21st century, in a world with iPhones and Android phones and 5G networks, is completely ass backwards. And if we don't understand that we are in a global political war, one that you are not going to win this war by beating the Democratic Party. No. The Democratic Party is just another party in the United States, just like there are other political parties in the free world. The enemy, from a political standpoint, is the Chinese, is the only political party that sees both parties in this country as an enemy, right? Because they are in an independent constitutional republic. Now, whether we agree on policies or not doesn't really matter. What matters is that in order to preserve our republic, we had better fix our problem with war. Thanks.